we'll see how far we go on 6 chapters. I wish I welcome. It's good to see each of you here. It's nice to have a little bit cooler weather, isn't it? Even with cloudy, it's nice. So, we are going to pick this up, last chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 31. And they also want us to go into 2 Samuel, chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. And, as if that's not enough, 1 Chronicles chapter 10. So, we'll see how it plays out. Keep in mind, when this was originally written, it was consolidated into the Hebrew as one book, and then it was later split into 2. So it makes sense that there would be a flow from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel with this. Now, we're only going to get so far today, and then next Sunday, Brother Dan's going to start off with a whole fresh topic and study in the book of Mark. So it'll be a whole shifting of gears, even though we're kicking off 2 Samuel this morning. As way of introduction, last week we looked at 1 Samuel chapters 27 through 30. We didn't get through all 4 chapters, but in it we saw King of Gath, Achish, calling David to go into battle with him against whom? King Saul and the nation of Israel. God intervened on David's part. David had put himself in a pickle. That's how we did. I don't know that David would have used that description back then, but that's what we would say today, is he put himself in a pickle. Because the Philistines were the enemies of Israel, and that's where he took refuge. He sought safety instead of seeking safety in God. God delivered David from having to go to war against Saul and the children of Israel. However, in sending David and his men back to Ziklag, a city that the Philistines had taken over, he found the city burning, and their families and all the spoils had been taken. And so he and his men, after what had already been a hard march, had to go on and continue in pursuing the Amalekites who had done the destruction. God gave them a great victory, and he returned. And where we're picking up this morning is back where David and Achish were getting ready to go to war against Israel. But now it's without David. Now it's the Philistines and the Israelites. And that's where we pick up here in chapter 31. Not only, when you look at chapter 31, and again, I'm going to try to summarize as much as I can so that we can sort of move through the events that occurred. But in the battle, Philistines and the Israelites, led by Saul, the Philistines routed the Israelites. They devastated the Israelites. Many of the valiant men from the Israelites had died in the battle, but it included Saul, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua were who? Saul's sons. 3 of them. 3 of them. Because later on, we are going to have another son who takes the throne of Israel, and that would be Ishbosheth. All right. Saul was mortally wounded by an archer's arrow, and he commanded his armor-bearer to kill him so that the Philistines wouldn't come in and finish him off in some ill-fated manner. However, the armor-bearer refused to do it. And so Saul, we're told in those first 3 verses, Saul fell on his sword and took his own life, and then the armor-bearer did the same. That brings us to verse 4, where it says, Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it, which I already mentioned. What's the irony here? Saul was seeking to kill whom? David. David, on 2 separate occasions, had the opportunity to take Saul's life, but he refused to. Why? He was God's anointed, okay? And so David refused to. Although Saul made David his enemy, David refused to make Saul his enemy. He still recognized him as God's anointed over the nation of Israel. So who took Saul's life? Saul did. Saul did. He did it himself. First Chronicles, and we're going to, in these first, in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel and 1 Chronicles chapter 10 correlate. They're almost word by word the same, but there's a few things that are noted in 1 Chronicles that are not. The first one is 1 Chronicles 10:6, where it says, So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and all his house died together. And I think that's a little clearer than the way that 1 Samuel 31 puts it, where there it says all his men died. I think that all his men is referring to the household of Saul. So it's a little bit clearer. So here on one day, and remember, this was brought about upon Saul because of Saul's disobedience. His kingdom was taken, but then Saul sought after God when the Philistines were come up, and God refused to answer him. And so who did Saul go to? Yeah, the woman with the familiar spirit, the witch from Endor. And he inquired of the woman, actually asked the woman to please bring back the spirit of Samuel, who had died. And I believe by the power of God, not that she was a godly person. God often uses ungodly people to accomplish his purposes. But God allowed Samuel to come and actually prophesy to Saul, you're going to die tomorrow. And the Israelites will be soundly defeated. So this was the fulfilling of Samuel's prophecy. And on that day, the king and 3 princes, plus his armor-bearer, and many soldiers died on the battlefield for Israel. Oftentimes our actions, and I've said this many times, many other people have said it over and over again, I wish my skull wasn't so thick that I would listen to it better. Our actions don't just affect us. They affect everyone around us. We need to consider the things that we do, the things that we put over the things of God, and understand that there are consequences to our actions. And we can push it in the back of our mind. We can try to soothe ourselves. But if you're a child of God, God chastens his own. But oftentimes, it does impact those that we love the most. We'll see it in David's life. Later on, and it won't be the next quarter, but later on, when you go on into David's reign as king of Israel, we find David getting involved with Bathsheba. Who suffered the greatest consequence of that affair, that issue? The child died. The child died. David was in great mourning. How many times have we put our children at risk or others that we love at risk because of our own actions? All right, let's go ahead and move on. So we have Saul dying, 1 Chronicles 10:6, I read. So Saul died, his 3 sons, and all his house died together. His armor-bearer died with him. 1 Samuel 31:7 coming back, and when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley and they that were on the other side of Jordan saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So what's this verse telling us? How severe was this beating? Yeah, they abandoned the people, abandoned the cities. That didn't normally happen. But they abandoned the cities. Everything that was theirs was left behind, and they fled for their lives. The soldiers fled for their lives. They were in complete disarray. It was a devastating defeat. Another indicator that it was a devastating defeat was when Saul died, what happened to his body? Yeah, normally, no man left behind is the philosophy of soldiers. They would take their dead and take them with them. This is the king of Israel. And what did they do with his corpse, Israel? They abandoned it. They left him on the battlefield. What did the Philistines do? When you look at 1 Samuel 31:8 through 10, somebody read that. 1 Samuel 31:8 through 10. And then 1 Chronicles chapter 10, 9 and 10, somebody read that. 1 Chronicles 10, 9 and 10. All right, so the first thing they did was they stripped off his armor. They mutilated his body. And then they sent it throughout to publish it. Now, as an Israelite, here is our king, here's our leader that we've been following, dead and being published throughout. How do you feel about that? Is that demoralizing a little bit? Yeah, and that was the intent behind it. Not only that, but what did they do? It says they stripped off his armor and sent it to the land of Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols. 1 Chronicles says to carry tidings unto their idols and to the people. What was the deal with their idols? What were they saying? Yeah, it gave them an opportunity to proclaim, our gods are greater than the God of Israel. Look how our gods have delivered us. Are we guilty of that in our lives? Do we give cause for lost people to look upon our God, the true God of heaven, and say, your God is nothing, look at you? Too oftentimes in our lives, we bring shame upon the true God of heaven. So That's what they were doing. They were giving credit to their idols. They were praising their idols for bringing about that. Of course, Brother Jacob just recently, in condemning Israel, talking about the idols. The idols are what? It's a hunk of wood. It's a hunk of stone, or it's a hunk of metal that somebody has shaped and fashioned. And if it falls over, what do you have to do? You got to set it up again. We saw that previously with the Ark of the Covenant before the idol Dagon. But it gave them an opportunity to brag about their gods, and too oftentimes we as God's people give others an opportunity to mock the true God of heaven. They desecrated his body. They praised their false gods for the victory. 1 Samuel 31:11 says, "And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul," and then we're going to skip to 1 Chronicles 10:12 through 14, they took action. They arose, all the valiant men, and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, and brought them to Jabesh, and buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. So Saul died for his transgression, which he committed against the Lord, even against the word of the Lord, which he kept not, and also for asking counsel of one that had a familiar spirit to inquire of it, and inquired not of the Lord. Therefore he slew him, and turned the kingdom unto David, the son of Jesse. So this was proclaimed upon Saul because of his disobedience and because of his seeking out a familiar spirit, woman with a familiar spirit. Who suffered the consequences? Well, not only Saul, just as Samuel had prophesied, but his sons died that same day. His armor bearer died, and many valiant men suffered and died. The nation was pushed into turmoil, all because of one man, Saul. Again, I cannot overemphasize, our actions have consequences, and it's not just on us. Jabesh Gilead, why do you think that they rose to the occasion and took on a dangerous mission to recover Saul's body and to bury it? Any ideas? It's exactly right. If you go back to 1 Samuel 11, we won't go back there, but it was a newly appointed King Saul when he was still following after God's commands. It was one of the first acts that he did when Nahash, the Amorite leader, went up against the city of Jabesh Gilead. That Saul roused the Israelites and amassed an army, and they went in and defeated the Amorites. This is 40 years later. Did they remember it? I think so. I think that's the reason. There was a loyalty there because they knew what Saul had done early on. And so I think that's the reason they rose up. It's not saying that that was the only place that there were valiant men. It's not saying that at all. But there was a particular loyalty of this city towards Saul because of what he had done 40 years before. I believe is the reason. It's not stated specifically. All right. Any other thoughts, comments? We just finished 2 chapters. Mark that. It's only taken how many years? All right. We then move on into 2 Samuel chapter 1. And here, David has returned from defeating the Amalekites. And he had just arrived at Ziklag city, his city that was given to him, and was there for 2 days when news of this battle came. So it's picking up at that point. A man came, and the man had ashes and sackcloth on, indicating what? Mourning. And he reported the devastation of the battle to David, along with the death of Saul and Jonathan. We pick it up in chapter 1, verse 5. If somebody would read verses 5 through 10. 2 Samuel 1, 5 through 10. Now, this is the story that this man is giving to David. What's the problem with the story? It's not true. If you go back again to 1 Samuel 31, beginning in verse 3, and the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, Draw thy sword, and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through, and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. And then his armor-bearer did likewise. Now, that's also the same series of events that's given in 1 Chronicles chapter 10. What has this man changed? He put himself in the middle of the story. He does give it correctly. Behold, Saul leaned upon his spear. Okay? But then, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him, and when he looked behind him, he saw me. Now, is there any account of that in either of those other two? No. And called unto me, and I answered, Here am I. And he said unto me, Who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. Now, what's an Amalekite doing there? Who are the Amalekites enemies of? Israel. Who are they friends with? The Philistines. So, that's right. There were 400 that escaped. That was it from the battle. I don't know if he was one of those 400 or if he was from another Amalekite city or something. But he claims, he said unto me again, Stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish, this is Saul speaking, according to him, for anguish is come upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. So I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. And I took the crown that was upon his head, and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them hither unto my Lord. Now, you have somebody who does not like you. They don't like you to the point that they're trying to kill you. And then you get word they died. You happy? You sad? How do you feel about that situation? Yeah, many of us, at the very least, would be relieved. We'd feel safety in it. Again, while Saul considered David his enemy, David did not consider Saul his enemy, even though Saul sought his life. He still looked upon Saul as the anointed of God. So, as we look at this account, the problem with it is he lied. Again, neither of the accounts give any credence to what he says about himself killing Saul. Now, did David know that? This is the first words that David has gotten of what transpired on the battlefield. Even though Saul was trying to kill David, David still refused to take actions against Saul, take his life at least. Verses 14 through 16, again, we're back in 2 Samuel 1, 14 through 16. And David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Now, this was after David had mourned. This was after David had contemplated. He then comes back and he asks the man, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Would the armor bearer do it? No. When David had an opportunity to kill Saul, he refused. David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. And he smote him that he died. And David said unto him, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Had he actually killed Saul? Now, you would say, if he had killed Saul, maybe he should be killed, right? Was David right or wrong in killing this man? He did it based on the information this man told him. He didn't have other information. This was a confession of the man. Now, why did this man bring this confession to him? Well, later on, we'll get there, David at least tells us that this man was looking for reward from David. Why? Because he didn't realize David's attitude toward Saul. He just thought, enemy, enemy. So, regardless of that, he lied. And according to the law of Moses, what was the consequence of lying? Death. The crown and the bracelet. Yeah. So, certainly there was... Well, anyway, while many of us, if we were in David's shoes, we'd have been relieved at the news of Saul's death. If not, I think many probably would have been jubilant. A lot of people might have celebrated because their enemy was dead. But again, David didn't identify Saul as his enemy. And in fact, as you go on through chapter 1, you'll see that David laments the death of Saul and Jonathan in particular. He writes a psalm. Verse 17 and 18 of chapter 1, And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Asher. Now, where do you find the book of Asher? It's right there with the book of Hezekiah. When you find it, you'll find it, Jasher. Actually, it's an old Hebrew book that was full of poetry and military exploits. It's also referred to in Joshua 10, 12 through 15. Verse 19 through the end of the chapter records the words of the Psalms, and they memorialize Saul and Jonathan. How many times in that psalm does David speak of Saul in a negative fashion? 0. This is the man that sought his life. But he consistently refers to him as the anointed of God, as being valiant, and certainly in Saul's earlier years, there is no question that he was. Verse 19 says, The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Verse 23 says, Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Is he claiming that Saul was without sin without error? No, not at all. But he would not speak against God's anointed, and proclaimed that this psalm should be spoken of. He finishes the psalm again in verse 27 with, "How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished." Now, that closes the book on Saul, but not Saul's family. As we continue into chapter 2, chapter 2 begins, now that Saul is dead, and Jonathan, who would be the heir apparent to the throne, also died, along with his other two sons. We see in chapter 2 that David inquires of God. There it says, "And it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" And what was the Lord's response? Go up. And David inquired a second time, and God said, he inquired a second time, well, where do I go? Go to, Brother Homer said it, Hebron. Okay? He actually inquires twice. You know, should I do this thing? Yes. How should I do it? This way. You know, too oftentimes we don't inquire of God at all. But sometimes we'll make that first inquiry and we'll get that first response, but then we don't go back to find out the hows. You know, go over here. What do you want me to do? Oftentimes, it's not just a single answer, and then we take it on our own. But God has more for us. David asked, should I go up? And where? And he was given Hebron. So David went up thither, and his two wives also, Ahinoam and the Jezreelitess, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, Nabal's wife, the Carmelite. Again, she was the widow of Nabal. So he goes up. In verse 4, verse 4 says, "And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying that the men of Jabesh Gilead were they that buried Saul." Now, David is anointed. Is this the first time? No. Where was the first time? Who anointed David? Yes. At his father's house, Samuel anointed David according to God's instructions. It was more of a private anointing, not unlike Saul's. Remember that Saul was anointed 3 times, and David, in the end, would be anointed 3 times. This is the second anointing. The first was God's anointing as God's man, the man that God chose to lead Israel. This anointing was specific for what? To what? Yeah, king over the house of Judah. Now keep in mind, when David had fled to Achish at Gath, and then asked for a city, and the king gave him Ziklag, David got busy for about 16 months doing what? Destroying the Amalekites, the enemies of Israel, but reporting back to Achish that he was raiding into Israel, giving him the thought that he was aligning himself with the Philistines, when in fact he was actually bestowing upon those cities, and we didn't get there, but when he chased after the spoils and retrieved the spoils from Ziklag, he also took in the spoils from other cities from the Amalekites' raids and destruction. And what did he do with many of those spoils? He shared it with the cities of southern Judah. So he had built a rapport with them, showing him his loyalty still remained, and being a benefactor toward them. And so here we see some of the consequences of that, in that they looked to him when he, with Saul gone, and they made him king over Judah. Now, that's verse 4. It also, we talked about Jabesh Gilead, verses 5 and 7. Upon hearing that the men of Jabesh Gilead, Saul's most loyal allies, had retrieved and buried the body of Saul, what did David do? He showed kindness to them. Why was that important? It was right because they had done the right thing. But what else? As a city who was loyal to Saul, right down to the very end, in valiantly going and collecting up his body, David, in his praise of them and blessing toward them, showed his character toward them at the same time. He was not full of animosity. He was not full of vengeance. But he would be a king who would sit on the throne and righteously judge. And that would mark a major difference between David and Saul. So it actually offered an opportunity for them to and in fact, he actually states in those verses, encouraging them to join him as their new king. He doesn't force it, but he encourages them. We go on to chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, and we're reacquainted with Abner. Now, the last time that Abner's name came up was back in 1 Samuel chapter 26. Anybody recall what happened there? This is while Saul was still chasing after David, and David had hid. And then David and Abishai snuck into the camp of Israel, the camp of Saul, Saul being bedded down in the center of the camp. And they took a spear and they went back out of the camp and called out. David said to Abner, what? Why aren't you protecting your king? I could have killed him. He embarrassed Abner. Well, here's Abner again, appearing for the first time since then. Verses 8 and 9 says, But Abner the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all Israel. So Abner, Saul's military leader, took and made Saul's son Ishbosheth king over all of Israel with the exception of Judah. You get a glimpse of Abner's power in this. Abner was considered a great military man. And then we go on. He made him king over Gilead and over the Asherites. It tells us in verse 10, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old. Now my question is, 40 years old, where was he in the battle? But you're going to see, if we get far enough along, there's probably a good reason. I don't think he had any gumption. I don't think he had any courage. He was not a valiant individual at all. But he was the king's son. He was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel and reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. The time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So I need to catch up here. Otherwise, we'll get bogged down. All right. We pick it up here at verse 16. We have Abner, who led the armies of Ishbosheth, Israel, and we have Joab, who led the armies of David, Judah. As we come to verse 14, they gather, actually 13 sort of begins it. They come together at the pool of Gibeon with one army on one side and one army on the other side. And as they're facing off each other, what did they decide to do? That was thrown out there by Abner. Let's play a little game. Gladiator. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. This was before the gladiators, I guess. But how about we put 12 of my men against 12 of yours? Now, if we do that and one defeats the other, what's the outcome? Supposedly. If my 12 beat your 12, then, yeah, we'll settle this just among our 12. Now, what was the problem with that? We would call it locking horns. My brother and I locked horns often. We didn't do it quite this way. Our hair wasn't long enough. But they actually locked hairs of head and they pierced each other through. All 12, both sides, died. So what did they gain from it? There was no clear outcome from it, and so it tells us that there was a great battle that ensued. Verse 16 tells us, and they caught everyone his fellow by the head, thrust his sword in his fellow's side, so they fell down together. Wherefore that place was called Helkath Hazarim, which is in Gibeon. And there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten, and the men of Israel before the servants of David. And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab, he was the one that led David's army, and Abishai and Asahel, and Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe. Now, what's that indicate to you? He was extremely fast, extremely fast. Reminds me of me when I was young. Maybe not. Okay. He was extremely fast. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right nor to the left from following Abner. Now, Abner is the leader of the Israelite army and a mighty man of war. Abner sees who's following and recognizes him, and what does he tell him to do? First he says, turn to the right or turn to the left, and find one of the young men and take their armor. What's he telling him to do? Kill somebody else and take their armor and claim it. I don't care what you do. Just back off. He's warning him. But Asahel wouldn't turn aside. He does it again. He warns him, turn aside. I don't want to smite Asahel. And why? Why is Asahel so key to Abner? So important to Abner? He is the brother of Joab. And don't think that Joab wouldn't hold that against Abner if he killed him. However, Asahel would not, and so what finally happened? Yeah. Eventually, he stopped, he caught him, and he killed him. How? Spear under his 5th rib. Now, I don't know what's special about the 5th rib, but 5th rib comes into play 2 more times in these chapters that we're looking at. He killed him, smote him under his 5th rib. Now, how did he do it? Verse 23 says the hinder end of the spear. He didn't use the spear end, he used the other end. Now, can you imagine a blunt object going through like that? It probably was not blunt. What would they oftentimes do when they stopped to pause? They would take their spear, they wouldn't lay it on the ground, they would stick it in the ground. Now, you can't do that with a blunt object, so it had to be sharpened. And so while it wasn't the spear end, it was still sharpened and was evidently able to drive through under that fifth rib of Asahel. Of course, it's not hidden. Joab and Abishai continue to pursue, and the armies pursue until finally Abner says, how long are we going to do this? It's at this point he calls out, aren't we brethren? Now that sounds convenient, doesn't it? You know, when you're being tracked down, hunted, then pull in, we are all Israelites, are we not? We are of the tribes of Israel, which was true. And Joab and the armies of Judah stopped, paused, and they parted and went back. But the bitterness didn't stop there. The end of the chapter, we get down to verses verse 30. And Joab returned from following Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there lacked of David's servants 19 men and Asahel, so a total of 20. Now, one of them was Asahel. Of those 19, what were the other 12? They were the 12 at the pool. So how many did David's army lose in the battle? 12 plus Asahel is 13 out of a total of 27. Is that right? Is my math right? 7. Now, you go on, verse 31, but the servants of David had smitten Benjamin and of Abner's men, so that 360 men died. How many is that? 300 is plus 300, 360 men. I would say that was an overwhelming defeat for Abner. Any comments? We're blazing through this. Any comments, questions, or thoughts? Chapter 3. In this chapter, Abner makes peace with David and then is killed by Joab. So he doesn't live long enough to enjoy the peace. We began with chapter 3 telling us that there was basically civil war between Ishbosheth and David. But while Ishbosheth kept getting weaker and weaker, David was getting stronger and stronger along the way. Verses 2 through 5 then list 6 of David's wives and 6 sons. Now, he may have had more, and in fact, we know he had at least one more, because there was his first wife by the name of Michal, Saul's daughter, who did not have a son. She's not things. There is no scripture that indicates that God ever condoned this. It was a custom, though, by many kings and non-kings at the time. Chapter 3 and verse 6 says, and it came to pass while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David that Abner made himself strong for the house of Saul. Now, while Ishbosheth and Israel is getting weaker and weaker, what's Abner doing according to this verse? He's gaining more and more power within the household of Ishbosheth. And in fact, as we look at these verses, I think what we'll find is that Ishbosheth had the crown, but Abner had the power. Verse 7 says, and Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, wherefore hast thou gone in unto my father's concubine? Abner responds in a very angry fashion. And his response really leads you to believe, although we're not told for sure one way or another, that this was a false claim against Abner. Now, what was the big deal about this claim? Someone going into the king's concubine was what? An indication of? It was adultery. It happened, it's recorded another time, actually happening to David, was it not? It's treasonous. It's a claim upon the crown. And so that was the accusation from Ishbosheth. I started to say this little weasel. I don't, that might be overstating it. I don't know. But that was his claim. Again, Abner, in verses 8 through 11, said, Then Abner, very wroth for the words of Ishbosheth, and said, Am I a dog's head, which against Judah do show kindness this day unto the house of Saul thy father, and to his brethren, and to his friends, and have not delivered thee into the hand of David? Now, think about, how did Ishbosheth become king? Abner made him king. Who was fighting on behalf of Ishbosheth against David? Abner was. Ishbosheth wasn't. He was staying behind. In fact, I don't know if he ever got out of bed. According to, every time we find him here, seems he's laying down, he's sleeping, or whatever. It was Abner that had done these things. And he goes on and says, that thou chargest me today with a fault concerning this woman. So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord hath sworn to David. Now, think about what Abner is saying. As the Lord hath sworn to David, what did God swear to David? He would be the king. What's Abner saying here? David's the one that's supposed to be the king. Indication is Abner knew it all along. That's what I get from this. Even so, I do to him to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. And he could not answer Abner a word again because he feared it. Again, I think the indication was that he knew all along that it was God's promise, it was God's will that David would be the king of Israel. Why did he establish Ishbosheth on the throne? It might be so that he could rule. There was a relationship there. Abner and Joab both had relationships. Joab was the nephew of David. Abner is the cousin of Saul. And so there was a relationship there. So it might have been loyalty to family. It might have been for that opportunity to rule at some point. Don't know. But in doing so, knowing God's will, he went against God's will. Sometimes does family come into our choices and cause us to make decisions that are not God's will? They have for me. Doesn't make it right. And doesn't mean that God won't chasten us for it. We need to be careful because, again, sometimes we're jeopardizing those we love the most. With the defection of Abner and the weakness of Ishbosheth becomes apparent because when Abner goes to David to make a deal, what's David's contingency upon making a deal? I won't even talk to you until bring me my wife, Saul's daughter. And so Abner goes, and David sends servants to Ishbosheth, king of Israel. And what does Ishbosheth do? Yeah, this is the king of Israel. He took Michal away from the wife that Saul had in turn given her to and sent her to go back to David. So again, we see the weakness of Ishbosheth, especially without having Abner at his side. He yielded to that request. Abner, in the meantime, has communication with the elders of Israel, the other tribes, and talks to them about David. In times past, when Saul was still on the throne, some had sought that David would be king over them, verses 17 and 18. And he says, "Now then do it, for the Lord hath spoken of David, saying, By the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines and out of the hand of all their enemies." So again, it further reinforces Abner knew it. He's now, because of Ishbosheth's accusation, he's now turned and is ready to support David and his throne. What happens to Abner? He comes and meets with David. He leaves in peace. Joab returns from a great victory and finds out what? Abner's been there. They talked. He left in peace. Joab, happy or unhappy? Yeah, this is the man that killed his brother. And so what does he do? He sends servants to bring Abner back. And what happens? He stabs him. Where? Under the fifth rib. Now, it might have been specific because that's how his brother was killed. I don't know. So Abner, again, didn't live to take advantage of that opportunity for peace. However, how did David react to the whole thing? Yeah, he wept for Abner. Even though Abner was indeed his adversary in battle, what Joab did was not, it was without David's consent as king of Judah. He deceived him. He deceived Abner in it. And there was curse put upon him. In fact, when David was on his deathbed, in 1 Kings chapter 19, I think it is, what does David tell Solomon? Because of that event, you need to take care of Joab. And Solomon follows through. Ishbosheth. What happens to Ishbosheth? He's sleeping, and two men come in and put a knife under his fifth rib. So he's assassinated in his sleep. And then what do? They cut off his head, and they bring it to David, thinking, David's going to reward us. He did. What was their reward? He killed them. So, all right. Any thoughts? God does not leave it to us to take out our own vengeance. We need to leave things in His hand. Too many times today, there are so-called Christians that are out there who are willing to pick up arms to on their own behalf or for their own causes. But we're here, the Lord's people are here to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, a message of salvation, and not a message of death. So it's sort of a, oh yeah.